gaseous diffusion plants are in the lower left, near the S50 thermal diffusion plant. The X10 was for plutonium production. Centrifuges. The centrifuge process was regarded as the only promising separation method in April 1942. 135. Jesse Beams had developed such a process in the 1930s, but had encountered technical difficulties. In 1941 he began working with uranium hexafluoride, the only known gaseous compound of uranium, and was able to separate uranium-235. At Columbia, Carl P. Cohen produced a body of mathematical theory making it possible to design a centrifugal separation unit, which Westinghouse undertook to construct. 136. Scaling this up to a production plant presented a formidable technical challenge. Urey and Cohen estimated producing a kilogram, 2.2 pound, of uranium-235 per day would require up to 50,000 centrifuges with 1 meter, 3 feet 3 in, rotors, or 10,000 centrifuges with 4 meter, 13 feet, rotors, assuming that 4-meter rotors could be built. The prospect of keeping so many rotors operating continuously at high speed appeared daunting. 137. And when Beams ran his experimental apparatus, he obtained only 60% of the predicted yield, indicating that more centrifuges would be required. Beams, Urey and Cohen then began work on a series of improvements which promised to increase efficiency. However, frequent failures of motors, shafts and bearings at high speeds delayed work on the pilot plant. 138. In November 1942 the centrifuge process was abandoned by the Military Policy Committee. 139. Research into the centrifuge method advanced significantly after the war with the introduction of the Zip-type centrifuge, which was developed in the Soviet Union by Soviet and captured German engineers. 140. It eventually became the preferred method of uranium isotope separation, being far more economical. 141. Electromagnetic separation. Electromagnetic isotope separation was developed at the University of California Radiation Laboratory. This method employed devices known as calutrons. The name was derived from the words California, University and cyclotron. 142. In the electromagnetic process, a magnetic field deflected charged particles according to Thomas. 143. The process was neither scientifically elegant nor industrially efficient. 144. Compared with a gaseous diffusion plant or a nuclear reactor, an electromagnetic separation plant would consume more scarce materials, require more manpower to operate, and cost more to build. Nonetheless, the process was approved because it was based on proven technology and therefore represented less risk. Moreover, it could be built in stages, and rapidly reach industrial capacity. 142. A large oval-shaped structure. Alpha I racetrack at Y12 Marshall and Nichols discovered that the electromagnetic isotope separation process would require 5,000 short tons, 4,500 tons, of copper, which was in desperately short supply. However, silver could be substituted, in an 11:10 copper to silver ratio. On the 3rd of August 1942 Nichols met with Undersecretary of the Treasury Daniel W. Bell and asked for the transfer of 6,000 tons of silver bullion from the West Point Bullion Depository. 145. Ultimately 14,700 short tons, 13,300 tons, 430 million troy ounces, were used. 146. The 1,000 troy ounce, 31 kilograms, silver bars were cast into cylindrical billets, extruded into strips, and wound on two magnetic coils. 146, 147. a long corridor with many consoles with dials and switches, attended by women seated on high stools. The Calutron girls were young women who monitored Calutron control panels at Y12. Gladys Owens, seated in the foreground, was unaware of what she had been involved in. 148. Responsibility for the desert-land construction of the electromagnetic separation plant, which came to be called Y12, was assigned to Stone and Webster in June 1942. The design called for 5 first-stage processing units, known as alpha racetracks, and 2 units for final processing, known as beta racetracks. In September 1943, Groves authorized construction of 4 more racetracks, known as Alpha 2. Construction began in February 1943. 149. The second Alpha I was operational at the end of January 1944. The first Beta and first and third Alpha I's came online in March, and the fourth Alpha I was operational in April. The 4 Alpha 2 racetracks were completed between July and October 1944. 150. Tennessee Eastman was contracted to manage Y12. 151. The Calutrons were turned over to trained Tennessee Eastman operators known as the Calutron Girls. 152. The Calutrons initially enriched the uranium-235 content to between 13% and 15%, and shipped the first few hundred grams of this to Los Alamos in March 1944. Only one part in 5,825 of the uranium feed merged as product. Much of the rest was splattered over equipment in the process. Strenuous recovery efforts helped raise production to 10% of the uranium-235 feed by January 1945. In February, the Alpha racetracks began receiving slightly enriched 1.4% feed from the new S50 thermal diffusion plant, and the next month they received enhanced 5% feed from the K25 gaseous diffusion plant. By August, K25 was producing uranium sufficiently enriched to feed directly into the beta tracks. 153. Gaseous diffusion. The most promising but also the most challenging method of isotope separation was gaseous diffusion. Graham's law states that the rate of effusion of a gas is inversely proportional to the square root of its molecular mass. So in a box containing a semi-permeable membrane and a mixture of 2 gases, the lighter molecules will pass out of the container more rapidly than the heavier molecules. The idea was that such boxes could be formed into a cascade of pumps and membranes, with each successive stage containing a slightly more-enriched mixture. Research into the process was carried out at Columbia University by a group that included Harold Urey, Carl P. Cohen, and John R. Dunning. 154. Oblique aerial view of an enormous U-shaped building. Oak Ridge K25 plant. In November 1942, the Military Policy Committee approved the construction of a 600-stage gaseous diffusion plant. 155. On 14 December, M.W. Kellogg accepted an offer to construct the plant, which was codenamed K25. A separate corporate entity called Kellex was created for the project. 156. The process faced formidably technical difficulties. The highly corrosive gas uranium hexafluoride had used, as no substitute could be found, and the motors and pumps had to be vacuum-tight and enclosed in inert gas. The biggest problem was the design of the barrier, which had to be strong, porous and resistant to corrosion. Edward Adler and Edward Norris created a mesh barrier from electroplated nickel. A 6-stage pilot plant was built at Columbia to test the process, but the prototype proved to be too brittle. A rival barrier was developed from powdered nickel by Kellex, the Bell Telephone Laboratories, and the Bakelite Corporation. In January 1944, Groves ordered the Kelex barrier into production. 157, 158. Kelex's design for K25 called for a 4-story 0.5 mile, 0.80 kilometer, long U-shaped structure containing 54 contiguous buildings. These were divided into 9 sections containing cells of 6 stages. A survey party began construction by marking out the 500-acre, 2.0 square kilometers, site in May 1943. Work on the main building began in October 1943, and the 6-stage pilot plant was ready for operation on the 17th of April 1944. In 1945, Groves cancelled the upper stages, directing Kelex to instead design and build a 540-stage side feed unit, which became known as K27. Kelex transferred the last unit to the operating contractor, Union Carbide and Carbon, on the 11th of September 1945. The total cost, including the K27 plant completed after the war, came to $480 million. 159. The production plant commenced operation in February 1945, and as cascade after cascade came online, the quality of the product increased. By April 1945, K25 had attained a 1.1% enrichment, and the output of the S50 thermal diffusion plant began being used as feed. Some product produced the next month reached nearly 7% enrichment. In August, the last of the 2,892 stages commenced operation. K25 and K27 achieved their full potential in the early post-war period, when they eclipsed the other production plants and became the prototypes for a new generation of plants. 160. Thermal diffusion. The thermal diffusion process was based on Sidney Chapman and David N. Scott's theory, which explained it that when a mixed gas passes through a temperature gradient, the heavier one tends to concentrate at the cold end and the lighter one at the warm end. 161. It was developed by U.S. Navy scientists, but was not one of the enrichment technologies initially selected for use in the Manhattan Project. This was primarily due to doubts about its technical feasibility, but the inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy also played a part. 162. The Naval Research Laboratory continued the research under Philip Abelson's direction, but there was little contact with the Manhattan Project until April 1944, when Captain William S. Parsons, the naval officer in charge of ordnance development at Los Alamos, brought Oppenheimer news of encouraging progress on thermal diffusion. Oppenheimer informed Groves, who approved construction of a thermal plant on 24 June 1944. 163. A factory with 3 smoking chimneys on a river bend, viewed from above. The S50 plant is the dark building top upper left behind the Oak Ridge powerhouse, with smokestacks. Groves contracted with the H.K. Ferguson Company of Cleveland, Ohio, to build the thermal diffusion plant, which was designated S50. 164. Plans called for the installation of 2,142 48-foot tall, 15 diffusion columns arranged in 21 racks. Inside each column were 3 concentric tubes. Steam, obtained from the nearby K25 powerhouse at a pressure of 100 pounds per square inch, 690 kPa, and temperature of 545 degrees Fahrenheit, 285 degrees Celsius, flowed downward through the innermost 1.25-inch, 32 mm, nickel pipe, while water at 155 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 degrees Celsius, flow upward through the outermost iron pipe. The uranium hexafluoride flowed in the middle copper pipe, and isotope separation of uranium occurred between the nickel and copper pipes. 165. Work commenced on the 9th of July 1944, and S-50 began partial operation in September. Leaks limited production and forced shutdowns over the next few months, but in June 1945 the S-50 plant produced 12,730 pounds, 5,770 kilograms, of slightly enriched product. 166. By March 19